Hello, everybody. Pastor Darrell from The Quest in Galesburg, Illinois. So glad to have you stop by with us just for a few moments again today. I want to talk about something today that I want to look at from the scriptural perspective, but I also want to look at something that we deal with day in, day out. And many times we're just completely oblivious to that fact. And that is knowing your audience, knowing where you are, the people you're dealing with, and recognizing the differences that you have. I've said this many, many times over the years in my previous denomination where I was at, that I would talk with different overseers, different leaders, and I'd tell them, I said, we need to take great consideration when we bring pastors into areas. And I'll give you an example from my own life. I was born and raised in the East St. Louis area, mostly lived in not big cities, but in around city life. My wife and I went down to Tennessee, spent 6 years there, finished our schooling there, came back from there, and we went to pastor in a small town of about 1,100 people. I'm telling you, we were fish out of water. Difference was night and day. There was people in that town that had literally never spent the night in a motel before. They didn't know what that experience was like. They had never experienced the things that we went through. And they didn't say this to be harsh, but they called my wife and I, Ollie and Lisa, from Green Acres because we were that out of place. There was things that were said, things that were done that were so different. And they laughed at me because I didn't know some of their cultural things, and vice versa. They didn't understand mine. And I'll never forget one particular day I said something about looking out to the crowd, and every pastor can relate to this. That particular day, I'm telling you, they all look like they've been sucking on lemons or persimmons or something. And I said, y'all look like you've been down in the mully grubs. Well, that came from being in Tennessee for 6 years. The southern dialect came out. And when I said mully grubs, there wasn't a person in that room outside of my wife that understood what I was talking about because that was a cultural thing from down where we used to live in Tennessee. Mully grubs is a term for a pain in the belly, a pain in the intestinal region especially. When they didn't know it, and pardon my language, but I'm going to use it just the way it was. By Tuesday of that week, I was working a secular job at the time. My phone rang in my office there, and actually, my secretary called me. She said, Darrell, there's somebody on the phone, very upset you need to talk to. And it was one of my church members. They were upset. And it had gone all over town. Now, remember, we're in a town of 1,100 people, and they had spread around that I said from the pulpit, you all are a bunch of pains in the ass. Because they didn't understand what a mully grub was. They looked it up, and when they saw a pain in the intestinal region, therefore it must have meant what they came out of it. I'm sorry if my using that language offends you, but I want to show you how a cultural difference was something that separated, caused great offense. We need to be aware of that. We need to be aware when you've been born and raised in the southern states, in Tennessee, Alabama, wherever, and nothing against those, but when you all of a sudden move them to, say, northern Illinois or Minnesota, there can be a huge cultural barrier. Not always, but many times there is, and it's important to recognize it. Now, let me give you a biblical example of something. In Acts chapter 17, I want to read it to you from the New International Version. It says, a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him, talking about Paul. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. Now, that's bad enough as it is, but when you look it up in the original language, in the Greek, what is translated as foreign gods is daimonia. Daimonia is literally the word from which we get demonic. They were listening to him. Now understand, these were religious people. They had never heard of Christianity before, never heard of Jesus. They were deeply religious, deep philosophers, and to them, what he was preaching and teaching to them was so different that they attributed it to being demonic. Now, hear me out. This was a cultural barrier. Paul could have ran, but he stayed. And if you read on, it shows how that they sat and they reasoned with him and they talked with him, and some accepted what he was teaching. But Paul had to recognize there was a barrier between what his culture was and what their culture was. And this is so true today. So many times we go into a culture, let's just call it the way it is. Right here in my town, you can go from one part of town to another. For whatever reason, there is, I mean, trust me, it's not completely segregated. Right around my neighborhood, there are several black families, there's an Asian family, there's different cultures here. But if you go into certain parts of town, it's primarily black, or certain parts of town are primarily Hispanic. And so you have cultural differences that spring up. And so we do things, and it's completely different. You can say a word, and I did this just recently. I said something in Spanish, didn't know that I mispronounced it, and I said something very offensive to somebody. We need to recognize those differences, and by recognizing them, we can avoid problems. Now, let me just bring it home to roost. We Christians have a problem that we like to speak what I call churchese or Christianese. We use phrases, we use terminology that outside of the church is meaningless. I'll never forget this. About 16, maybe 17 years ago, not too awfully long after I came to Galesburg, a young lady had started attending the church, and I started talking about this issue, telling our people how we had to learn to relate to other people. And one of the young ladies that was there, who had not been a Christian very long, spoke up and told me, she said, when I first came here, I thought you all were crazy. She said, somebody told me how to get to the sanctuary, and she said, I didn't know what in the world a sanctuary was. She said, I thought it was a wildlife preserve or something. I didn't know. And she talked about the terms of salvation and things like that. Those are not terms that people in the general public who have not been churched know and understand. They can't relate to it. You go walk up and tell somebody they need to be saved, they don't have a clue what you're talking about. I did this very early in my Christian walk, that I shared with a friend of mine. I was so excited about what God had done in my life, and I went over to my friend's house, pounded on his door early in the morning. He come to the door, I drug him out of bed, sleepy, probably a little hungover knowing him, and I said, dude, something great has happened in my life, and you need to get saved. And he screamed to me, Dago, what are you talking about? Saved from what? I'm sorry, Dago is a name that they all called me at that time. And he was like, saved from what? He didn't have a clue what I was talking about. We need to be aware of who we're talking to and the language, the phrases that we use, because those things can divide us. Those things can cause a wall to build up immediately, and you'll never reach somebody because you lost them over a word or a phrase or something that they don't understand culturally. Knowing your audience makes all the difference in the world in spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's why Paul said that he became all things to all men, that he might by all means win some. You have to go with the flow. You have to change up who you are. The message never changes. Hear me. The message never changes. How you preach it, how you teach it, how you talk about it must change if we're going to be effective. I hope this helps somebody today. God bless you. If you have any questions, again, feel free to message me, call me. I'd love to talk with you. Till next time, come back and see me again here at The Quest.